virtue of possessing a durable network of more or less institutionalized relationships of mutual acquaintance and recognition. Now this is the critical piece for the difference of social capital, because an individual degree is not in the first instance necessarily social capital already. It becomes social capital when one, it is institutionalized. In other words, it is recognized by others and perceived by others as having value. So when we're talking peace building later, and we're saying what kinds of cultural capital will help in building peace building, then we will start asking, for example, in that example again that was about the burial, etc. Who in that context would have had social capital to be able to influence where the burial was going to be? Does the church did the congregation have social capital? In other words, did the community recognize that the church had, quote unquote, that value, or did it not? This is the theory behind the social capital, is that it's saying, if you have something that is valued by others, then you can use it for something. You can use it for either change or abuse, etc. So I was already talking, I was ahead of myself. Social capital has two components. It's a resource connected with group membership and social networks, like a church, like a union. I was in Jakarta last week, 2 weeks ago, and we met with they say it's the largest Muslim organization in Indonesia. It's the Ulama. And they said they have 90 million members. So they don't have necessarily political power, although some of their members are in government. But because they are a social network and there's group membership, the question is, what kind of social capital do they have? Do they have that kind of quote unquote capital or value that is recognized by others, so that they will say, we need to do something, and they can change the situation? Put that side by side with the Christian communities, which is, as I understand, a minority in Indonesia, and it is also a social network, and it has also group membership, but maybe it's not as large, and so maybe there is not the conversation or the value that is placed in it. So maybe the churches cannot do the kinds of things that this Muslim organization can do because of the group membership, the size of the group membership, and the extent of the social network. The second, and see here, depends on the size of the network of connections that can effectively mobilize. So social capital is about mobilizing, and you have a value that has the capacity to mobilize. In the past, in the United States, religion had a role. It had the capacity to mobilize. Leaders in the public square were theologians, were pastors, etc. That's not, it's still there, but it has changed. Because the value of religion in the United States as a formal sociological institution has gone down. What has gone up, interestingly, in the United States is the military. There is a higher regard for the military than the churches, if you go by statistics. So what's going on there in terms of the social capital of the military? Even forgetting what the economic power of the military is, and compare that with the churches. That's the question of how do we use social capital, or what kind of social capital do we have? And then the second characteristic is that it is, we talked about it already. To summarize, these two folks are kind of the thinkers that I drew on much more review than Putnam. But for Putnam, social capital is tied to moral obligations and norms. It's also social values like trust and social networks. We talked about that already. And for Bordeaux, there is of course economic, cultural, and social capital, which is mediated through symbolic capital. So that's the kind of way that social capital is. So if you look at the drawing here, this is how I understand what social capital is. At the center of social capital, there is always the notion of trust. Trust that something is of value. Trust in the network. So the question in social capital discourse, for example, is how do you develop trust? And how do you institutionalize trust? And then there's also conflict. Bordeaux has a more conflictual notion of social capital because of the fact, remember earlier I talked about the notion of the structure and the agency. So when you put different individuals or different organizations together, there's bound to be some kind of conflict. So even if they have the same understanding of what social capital is, because they are constituted differently, then there will always be part of the challenge of developing social capital is we'll have to look at the notion of conflict that's operating in that particular part of the world which you're interested in. In the example of the burial, the conflict that has to do with where the burial is going to be, who says the person can be buried there and cannot be buried there, the negotiations that have to happen, that's part of the structure and process of social capital. And of course, change and civil society. Now, so you cannot have, I think, a viable notion of social capital if you do not have a theory of change. Or in other words, of how things can become better or worse. So we also have to think about change as part of that. I think this is the human agency part. Let me stop there for a moment and maybe if there are questions about social capital. Is it as clear as a dark night without a moon? Yes.
So when we reflect on social capital, or later on when we are going to discuss on what kind of social capital we have here, we cannot leave the four factors away from each other.
It would.
Another, the previous so we have to consider all these four factors.
It would, in my view, it would be appropriate and best to try to account for these different elements in the notion of social capital, because the more you have these interrelations in these particular areas, the more you have a chance to address the issue. And why that is the case has to do with the fact that human political social reality is always tied to human beings and structures. So you have to try to develop an understanding of what's the relationship between mechanisms of trust and individuals. It is not enough, for example, trust is not only that, oh, I believe in you. There are institutional forms of trust. For example, you get on an airplane, you trust that that airplane and that pilot will actually take you to where you're going. If you do not have that, you will not board an airplane, right? And the crisis in whenever there's an airplane crash is always then, was it pilot error? Or was there something in the system that didn't allow for the system to check whether the engine was okay? I mean, so trust is more than I believe in whatever it is that you believe in. It has to do with certain mechanisms that are built in there. You come to this school because this school is accredited. Because this school, the government says, or your school's, an accredited school is probably better because the government has said, yes, it's a quality school. But then, in order to go there, you trust that the government is telling the truth. But what happens if the government is not telling the truth, right? So then this notion of social capital breaks down. And in transformation, if trust breaks down with the government, for example, what do you do in civil society, as in your organization, to try to develop trust, not necessarily trust in the government, but trust in let's say, the capacity of civil society, of your organizations, to make some kind of change. So trust is, this is multivalent, it has different places. Right? So if you don't deal with this, then you will just have conflict. You may just have conflict because people are different, they have different interests, etc. So how would you get together? How would you build a good society if you cannot get together? So somehow you need to develop some kind of trust. Right? So conflict, therefore, and trust need to be discussed in tandem. And social capital is always located. That's why I put civil society here, because social capital is not floating. Without this, this is nothing. So it has somehow got to be located, and we are asking, what is social capital? Who has social capital? We need to locate where that is. That's why I start with the body, that's why I start with practice, because that's where you go to begin to think about what this is value. Because value is not just floating up there. If it is, then that's part of commodification and reification. Value is always tied to a community. So, in fact, very important in nation building, for example, in the Indonesian context, or in Philippine context, or in other parts of the world, that there is a vital, working, trusting relationship between the government and its citizens. If that breaks down, then you're in trouble. Same thing in the church. If you don't trust your pastor, you won't want to be with them by themselves if you don't trust the pastor. No matter how good the preaching is, if you don't trust, if there's no relationship, you won't be able to develop that kind of relationship. So, part of the challenge of social capital is the question that we need to be asking about what do we mean by trust? How is it developed? How is it created? In relation to whom? These are some of the questions about social capital. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Yes.
Does social capital always imply power?
Well, by definition, it is capital if it has quote-unquote power. It would not be considered in the discourse itself. It would not be considered capital if it did not have some kind of power, because capital, by definition, and I don't really like this notion of capital actually. But anyway, in the discourse, capital is tied to one, increasing value, and two, being able to influence. And there are different levels of the kinds of that, right? So there's the economic. My family was not rich economically, but my father had his doctorate, and so he got access. He had because the doctorate was considered value. He was invited to become members of organizations where only the rich people could be members. Not because we were rich, but because he had quote unquote the social capital. And I hated it every time we went because we did not have a car, but because my father had quote unquote value, so the rich folk would come and pick us up in their car. And I got angry with my father because I said, Dad, why is it that we don't have a car? You're a member of this organization. I never could understand why social capital was the only thing that we had. So that's so then you see there's the conflict. So even inside this notion of an organization where you are members, if you are there because you have social capital, and if you're there if you have economic capital, there's bound to be challenges, right? So another story a little bit. Back when I was growing up, I fell in love with this young girl who belonged to a rich family. So all the suitors, all the ones who were interested in her, drove to their house with cars. I either walked or rode my bicycle.
Ah,
And I would park my bicycle next to the, to the nice car, and I would also walk in. But inside me, I was saying, Lester, you should not be here. You don't have a car. You do not have economic capital. And it was also how I valued the social capital. So you see, part of the challenge is, do we really value, what is it that, it's a question, not just of what is valued, but do we value, for example, social capital? In other words, do we believe in social capital? That would be a question. So there's a long way of answering. Yes, in the discourse, whenever you say social capital, it also always involves certain kind of power. Now, the other challenge of that has to do with whether social capital can compete with economic capital or with cultural capital. There are some parts of the world where economic capital is not necessarily the important thing. It might be cultural capital. Right? So part of the challenge, our challenge, is to discern whether, in fact, what kind of capital is operating in the societies in which we are. What kind of capital was operating when this person was being buried? Was it economic capital? Could, in other words, a rich person come in and say, here is $10,000, go ahead. Maybe there would be some that would say, not enough. This is more than, the death of my grandfather, who was this, that, and the other, cannot be bought by money. So part of the challenge in peace building is, if you talk about peace building, is to think about